Clothes Horse, the podcast that, well, I just gotta say, we're about 5 or 6 months into our move back to Lancaster County from Austin, Texas. And I am so much happier than I have been in a long time. And we're going to talk more today about my experience leaving fashion, as well as our guests' experience leaving fashion. But I just want to say that change is scary and change is often really good, even though it's uncomfortable along the way. And in terms of how awesome it is to live here in Lancaster County, well, you all have the chance to come and experience the majesty of this place this summer for the Clothes Horse Jamboree. I'm your host, Amanda, and this is episode 203. My guest this week is Dr. Colleen Pokorny, Assistant Professor of Apparel Design at Oregon State University. Before making the shift to education, Colleen was a technical designer in the world of fast fashion. And we're going to talk about so many things in this episode that many of you have reached out to ask me. So what are we going to cover? Well, what is a technical designer, for one? How has the speed of fast fashion made clothing fit even worse? Why aren't clothing sizes standardized here in the United States? Why do your product reviews matter? Trust me, as a buyer, I will tell you, your product reviews really matter. How do we set students up for a better transition from school to the fashion industry? And how can schools prepare designers for a more sustainable future? And what does a more sustainable fashion industry look like? And why and how did Colleen leave the fashion industry? And does she have any advice to share with all of us? So much to cover. And somehow we will also talk about Trader Joe's and how it has been caught behaving like fast fashion. So yeah, there's a lot to cover this week, and it is a long episode. And normally I apologize for that, but I had this revelation actually this morning as I was hanging laundry outside. Why am I apologizing? This is my podcast. And if you don't want to listen to it all at once, you can break it up into sections. That's what I always recommend. That's what I do with a lot of my favorite podcasts. I think I've mentioned one of my favorites is called Band Splained. It's about music. I love it. Please go give it a listen. Most of those episodes are 4 hours long, and I'm delighted. So yes, this episode is definitely going to be more than 2 hours, but I think you're really going to enjoy it, and you're going to learn a lot, and hopefully, you'll get inspired by it. Before we get started, I must once again remind you of the Clothes Horse Jamboree. I know I said last week that tickets were going up to $300 on June 10th, which is basically now, but I got really nervous that it wasn't enough time for all of you. So I am extending that increase in price to July 1st. But please buy your tickets soon so I can stop worrying about it and we can start planning food. And guess what? I have introduced a payment plan option. Some of you have used it already. I'm just throwing it out there for all of you. It's very easy. You don't even have to reach out to me. You can just do it yourself. I'll include this information in the show notes. You can find it there as well. Each payment is $50 spread over 4 payments. We can't do Afterpay or anything like that because those services only work with products. This is an event. So I guess we'll call this Brenda Pay. Yes, Brenda loves installment payment plans. Let's call it Brenda Pay. Okay, so Brenda Pay. It's $50 for payments. The first one happens when you buy your ticket. You're going to use promo code installment1 at checkout, and that's at the moment when you enter your payment info. It's at the end. You'll be charged $50 then, and you'll receive your actual ticket via email immediately. You're going to want to do this soon. I will send you a link to pay the remaining payments on 6/25, 7/25, and the week of the Jamboree. And if you need extra time during any of those periods, just let me know so I know what's going on. And yeah, if you have any other questions about this, you can reach out to me via email. Otherwise, get your ticket now because the payment plan option will disappear on July 1st, and then you'll have to work out something else with me. So go get your ticket now. It's going to be awesome. Dustin and I have been thrifting so many fabulous prizes for the games and other cool stuff we're going to do. seriously, some great yard sailing so far this summer. So please come and join us here in Lancaster County. It's going to be so much fun. If you're a small business or a listener of Clothes Horse who can't come to the Jamboree but would like to sponsor a ticket for someone else, shoot me an email too. I just made that happen last week for Empire Wool and Canvas. And of course, that option is out there for anyone else who would like to be so generous. Okay, shifting gears here. As I will mention in my conversation with Colleen, one of the questions I receive most often after where can I get inexpensive, sustainable underwear? That's the number one for sure. After that one is help. How can I leave the fashion industry? Can you help me? I don't know if I can help you per se, but I do think it would be helpful for me to explain how I left the fashion industry. And spoiler alert here, it was not easy. Any of you who have listened to Clothes Horse since the beginning know that my exit from the fashion industry actually began back in 2020 when I lost my job working for Nuuly, Urban Outfitters rental brand, in the early days of the pandemic. And it was really scary and hard because obviously there were no other jobs. That job gave me 2 weeks of severance, cut off my health insurance immediately. And this is pretty close to the beginning of the pandemic, right? It was horrible. The unemployment system here in Pennsylvania was super broken. And so I didn't receive unemployment for months as well. I'm the primary breadwinner in my family. And so this was a bad situation. And so what did we do? And I think this was all very educational for me, actually, for setting me up for my final departure from corporate buying and fashion. We moved. We moved out of the city. We moved out to Bird in Hand out here in Lancaster County because we needed to cut our expenses. And that was our rent was like 40% here of what it had been in Philadelphia. So that alone made things a lot easier. And yeah, we cut back on a lot of stuff, right? It was kind of easy to cut back on eating out or going places or buying things because, we couldn't go anywhere or eat out or buy things. So I did that and I started Clothes Horse. Now, I want to be honest with you all, and perhaps I have not been clear enough about this. And I say that because I receive, I would say every week or two, an email from someone who is planning to leave their job or leave their business or whatever they're doing and start a podcast as a means of supporting themselves. And I always feel like the biggest jerk, like I am a dream crusher, when I tell whoever it is that has emailed me that I do not recommend that. That it's really, really hard to make money in podcasting unless you're like on a network or you're like a celebrity. You have a large pre-established audience base, which even then I'd be pretty skeptical. It's just not easy, and the ramp up is really, really slow. So even today, 4 years into making Clothes Horse does not support me. It barely supports itself. A majority of the work I do is for free. I believe after I did my taxes this year, and it was very disheartening when it all shook out, if I only worked 40 hours a week on Clothes Horse every week last year, which I know is not true, I was paid $1 an hour for my work last year. So long story short, Clothes Horse not supporting me financially, not a substitute for a job, even though it is a job. And I would not recommend that you leave your job and decide that podcasting will replace it, because it will not. Perhaps one thing that did come out of 2020 that was really great, and 2021, me losing my job, me being unable to find a job, me being at home 24 hours a day, is that I was able to create a lot of content, make a lot of episodes, make a lot of social media posts, and build up a following. That is the silver lining of that, because certainly if I decided to start Clothes Horse right now, I wouldn't have that time. So I guess this is a good time because according to Stacy of Rainbow Vintage, no one knows I have a Patreon or I don't do a good enough job of reminding people that I do. So there are ways that you can support this show. There is Patreon. There's also the Apple subscription. If you feel uncomfortable with the subscription model, your finances are up and down, you just worry about that commitment, which I totally get. You can also do a one-time, you can give me $5 on Ko-fi, and trust me, right there's 5 hours of work I could do for $1 an hour. That's kind of awesome, right? So Ko-fi is an option as well. Anyway, continuing on here. So I obviously pretty fast on was like, well, podcasting isn't going to make me a living because it costs a lot to make a podcast. And back then I was literally selling my clothing and shoes and bags and all my stuff that I'd worn to work while I worked in the fashion industry. I was selling that stuff to fund Clotheshorse, to pay for microphones, to pay for the hosting service, all of the editing software, all the things that I needed. So as the pandemic wore on, I started seeing clients as a consultant, and it was actually like really awesome. I was like, wow, I am happier than I have been in a really long time. And when my unemployment ran out, I was actually like doing okay. But what happened is someone reached out to me and offered a job in Austin, Texas. And they made a lot of promises to me that this was going to be different, that this was going to be ethical and sustainable and community minded and all this stuff. And so we moved to Austin. Now, in retrospect, we should have stayed in Pennsylvania, but life is what it is. So we moved to Austin. The job was not good. I loved the people that I worked with. They were the highlight of it all. And in fact, to take that job and realize it was a mistake, move across the country, leave bird in hand, leave behind this good life that Dustin and I had been building together here in Pennsylvania, in a weird way, it was kind of worth it to get to know the people that I worked with at that job. But ultimately, the job was hard. And I'm going to tell you, I definitely didn't share that with my friends, my family, my partner, certainly not any of you. But it was hard, and it was making me sick physically and mentally because the company itself was run by someone who was very, very verbally abusive, incredibly sexist, said a lot of really transphobic things. Interestingly enough, is also a major Democratic donor in Texas. Like his office, every picture is just like a wallpaper of frame photos of him with every big Democratic luminary of the past 30 years, the Clintons, Nancy Pelosi, on and on. I'm pretty sure probably with Obama. So it was really, really hard. It was taking a toll on me, the humiliation, the screaming. It triggered things in my brain that were not good, that live within me as a survivor of child abuse, and this is a trigger warning for any of you, self-harm. You might want to fast forward 30 seconds, 60 seconds. But I started cutting myself, which I hadn't done since I was a teenager. And I'll tell you, I have scars on my arms from that. From this job last year where I was doing that to myself. And I look at them all the time. It's summer, so they feel a little darker, even though I'm wearing sunscreen. And I'll remind myself of why I took the big, scary leap away from that job. So early last year, I realized I couldn't do it anymore. Dustin had heard a few situations where I'd been screamed out via Zoom and was like, we got to get you out of there. I was like, I don't know what to do. We live in this house where literally our rent is $3,000 a month. And it's very expensive to live in Texas, especially in Austin. And Dustin is a freelancer. So, I was still the breadwinner for the most part. He just wasn't where I was financially. And I felt the pressure to stay at this job. But finally I said, okay, can I leave this job in the fall and we can move back to Lancaster County because I can't make it through holiday. Again, I can't get screamed at for November and December like last year. It ruined the holidays for me completely. Let's say that we try to move in October. So we start saving money now. We start looking at places to live and figuring out what our expenses would be and, all of that. And Dustin was like, okay, so that's a plan. So I want to say we made that decision in February or March. Well, I came home from work in June and I said, I quit my job today. And he was like, whoa, what? And I was like, I couldn't take it anymore. I was getting screamed at. Then he started screaming at someone who worked for me and humiliating her for eating food. And I can't do it anymore. I've got these cuts all over my arms. I'm getting scars on my arms. I can't focus on anything. It's affecting my ability to work on Clothes Horse because my self-esteem is so bad right now that I can't imagine why anyone would want to hear anything I have to say. And Dustin was like, okay, well, you quit your job. Fine. I'm glad you did. Good for you. And immediately, we'd already been starting to save money, right? And cutting back on things. I'm pretty frugal anyway, but like no restaurants, no shopping for anything unless we really, really needed it. We cut off all of our like subscription services, including like, our produce box, Netflix, all those things, just cut it off. And when I quit my job, I was like, okay, so I started selling my clothes and my books and my records and my Hello Kitty stuff to save up more money. And we decided, we're going to have to move. We need to move somewhere where our rent isn't $3,000 a month, where groceries aren't super expensive, where we have to have air conditioning on like 9 out of 12 months out of the year. And so we made the plan to move back here to Lancaster County. Which was a big change, but I was also pretty excited about it. And like I said at the top of this episode, very relieved by it. And, I sat down, me by now, I made a spreadsheet. I modeled out what our expenses would look like staying in Austin versus spending the money to move. Because trust me, it was very, very expensive to move from Austin to Pennsylvania again. Probably, I would say at least... I would say somewhere between $12,000 to $15,000, but I bet there are expenses that I'm missing. But ultimately, the money we were going to save on rent, on health insurance, it's cheaper here, groceries. In Austin, a lot of the roads are toll roads. We don't have to pay that anymore. The utilities, all these things. It was worth it. We would save so much money spending all that money to move. And so we moved. And I'm glad that we did. I also am lucky, and I'm not a person who has often felt very lucky, but I am lucky in that all of the clients I was working for before I took that job in Austin were excited to be able to work with me again. And some of them I'd never stopped working with. So I was working full-time at that job, working full-time on Clothes Horse, and seeing these clients, one, because I just liked working with them so much, but two, because it helped fund Clothes Horse. I'm lucky that I kept doing that because all those people wanted to keep working with me and work with me more and recommend me to their friends. So I actually do work full-time now with a wide variety of small businesses. Some of my clients are really small one-person businesses, and I work with them for like 1 hour a month. And there are others who I work with, 5 or 10 hours a week. And I work with all of these incredible makers, designers, boutiques, artists. It's incredible. It's actually like what a big life change in such a positive way. But it was scary along the way. Moving sucks. Definitely yelled at Dustin a lot. My body parts hurt. I had tons of bruises. We had to sacrifice fun times. We gave up our holidays. Also, I had COVID when we moved. That was great. Things weren't easy, but I guess that's kind of how it is. And I think the best piece of advice I can give you is that leaving fashion or retail or whatever industry you hate working in right now will not be easy unless you have a trust fund or a family that will help you out. And I do not have either of those things. And I'm going to tell you that for so many years of my life, fear kept me in many bad jobs for a long time. We tend to have larger conversations about how income inequality gives us the short end of the stick when it comes to healthcare and housing and education. But we don't talk enough about how being low income keeps us stuck and unhappy, how it makes us vulnerable to abusive situations both at home and at work. And leaving my job, honestly, taking that job after leaving fashion, getting back into this abusive situation work-wise, I took that job out of fear, a fear of how our family would survive because I have felt that responsibility for so long. And I was scared to leave it, but I'm so glad that I did. It's okay to be scared about making a change. And it's okay to take your time doing it. But I think starting to plan now will set you on the path to something better, even if it takes a long time to get there. Over the next few months, I'll be featuring other guests who made the jump from fashion to doing something else. And all of their journeys are different. But one thing they all have in common is that it was scary, that there were uncertain times, and every aspect of their lives changed for the better. Whew. Okay. Well, like I said, this is a long episode. So let's jump into my conversation with Colleen. Colleen, why don't you introduce yourself to everyone?
So I'm Dr. Colleen Pokorny. It's weird to use doctor because I'm still getting new to it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm an assistant professor of apparel design at Oregon State University in the College of Business. And that is located, for those of you who don't know, in Corvallis, Oregon.
Been there.
Yes, it's gorgeous. I'm looking outside today in my window and it is just beautiful. So sort of my path where I got to where I am, my undergraduate degree is in apparel design. I love to sew. I love to quilt. I love to make things. I discovered I could go to school and my homework could be sewing. And I was like, that's what I want to do. And then I worked in the fashion industry for about 7 years. I worked at the notorious Abercrombie and Fitch as a technical designer, and then a company called 31 Gifts doing handbags and soft goods production. And then I decided to go back to grad school, and I got a master's and a PhD in design with a focus in apparel studies from the University of Minnesota. I just got my PhD in July and then moved to Oregon like 2 weeks later to take my job at Oregon State. So that's where I am now.
One of the questions I receive most often via email, via DM is, I work in the fashion industry right now and I don't know how to escape. And people are like, can you give me advice? And I'm like, well, I mean, I don't know. I felt stuck in it for a very, very long time too. Why did you decide to leave? And was going into education the first idea you had?
It's a great question. And it's, as many things, it's a very nuanced answer. Part of the reason I decided to leave is, as a technical designer, we're often seen as sort of a service to the rest of our teams, the merchants, the designers, production. And despite the fact that we are actually engineers, and we don't get credit for being engineers, and it gets to feel like a very thankless job after a while, that we're just constantly trying to produce really awesome product and nobody gives you any credit for the work that you do. Yeah. So there was that sort of thankless job feeling.
Yep.
That's a day in and day out. And, when things go really well, design gets all the credit. When things go really badly, it all falls to the tech designer.
Yep.
So that's rough. But the other reason, part of it was I kind of got tired of making things for people who don't need more things. I was doing handbag, wallets, accessories, that kind of stuff. And we, like every season would try to develop a new wallet or a new lunch bag. And I'm like, why? Why are we doing this? So that sort of like hopeless spiral of, I don't feel like I'm improving the world in any manner, but I love technical design. I love the puzzle of it, the figuring it out. So I was like, okay, what do I do with this thing that I love, but how do I do it in a way that feels productive to the world? So that's part of the reason I left the fashion industry. The other reason is, when I was in undergrad, I did an honors project where I got to do a museum exhibition on the designer Arnold Scazi, fabulous designer from the 80s. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And it was so much fun. I loved researching objects and learning about, why they designed these things. And I loved putting the exhibition together, and that sort of experience really stuck in my mind for years, and I couldn't get it out. And when I kind of felt burnt out on the industry, I was like, maybe this is a time to explore this other thing that is really of interest to me, of museums, of historic objects, fashion history. So I kind of went back also to sort of explore this other side of this industry that I was really interested in.
I mean, I think that's really cool. I think that when you're stuck in the industry, or feel stuck in the industry, which I definitely felt for a very long time, when you're a buyer, it's even more complicated to figure out what you would do next, because inevitably, if you're not coming up with new things for people to buy and reasons for them to buy them, and in the clothing area, your skills are transferable to having, I don't know, coming up with things for people to buy or reasons to buy other types of things. And so like you could be a clothing buyer, but then you could go be, I don't know, I interviewed for a restaurant supply buying job, for example, at one point.
Yeah.
And so it feels like, oh, I'm just stuck in like selling people stuff. But, you know, I think the thing that I hear most when people reach out to me, and it's often designers actually more than buyers, who reach out to me and are just like, how do I get out of this? I went to school for this. It's not what I thought. It's so disheartening. All the things that you just said.
Yeah.
What do I do next? It often feels like the only thing you can do next is go start your own brand, which is not the simple, easy, accessible idea that it sounds like when you say it out loud.
No, it is not.
Right. And so this can contribute to that feeling of being stuck, you know, of just like, I don't know what to do. And, you know, I didn't go to school for fashion. I'm definitely not a designer. I often think about all of my friends over the years who've worked in design, whether it was technical design or regular old design, how demoralizing it must be to go to work every day for this thing that you went to school for because you're passionate about it, you love it, and then have to work on things that aren't great, that you're not necessarily proud of. And I feel like in the area of technical design, it has to be specifically very frustrating.
It can be very frustrating. I think, you know, especially when you go to school for apparel design, like we give students the flexibility to sort of create what they want. You know, oftentimes there's project parameters, but a lot of times your senior collection is like, make whatever you want, you know, what speaks to you. And it's like a lot of times we get people who do like bridal wear and all sorts of things. And then the students think like, oh, I'm going to go into the industry and I'm going to find a job doing that thing and I'm going to get to make that. And unfortunately, that's like a big lie that is really hard to get students to understand, that like you're going to get a job at a big company and you're going to get assigned to a team and you are going to work on whatever the heck that product is. It doesn't matter if your passion is bridal wear, like you're going to be doing men's sweatpants. That's what you get to do.
I just got really depressed.
I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's true. It's true.
Sorry.
I mean, every once in a while, I'll have a friend in design who's like, oh, no, I always wanted to be a sweater designer. Like, that's my passion. And I'm like, wow, that like really worked out for you. But most of the time, that is not the case. We can't change the industry being like, well, actually, your job is designing men's sweatpants. But how do we set students up for, I don't know, a smoother landing into the professional world?
I don't have a great answer for you. I think other than being transparent with them about what the realities of the industry are, you know, trying to bring in a lot of guest speakers who work in the industry to talk about what they do so that they understand the realities of it. You know, I think it is important that people do want to be independent designers, and that's great, but we know the reality of how successful people we're going to be at doing that. And it's pretty minimal. So it's also really hard to encourage students to do that when you feel like you're setting them up for failure. So in some ways it's more, it helps us to set them up to go into the industry because we know they can find a job, hopefully, and then maybe from there become an independent designer once they're established. But it's also important that you develop your own design aesthetic at some point so you have a point of view of what you can bring to a team. So it's how do you balance that out in education is really difficult. But I do think like things like sending them on an internship is really important so they understand what it actually is like and can maybe potentially realize, ooh, I don't like that before it's too late.
Yes. No, I think that is a really valid call out because, you know, I obviously like did not plan on a career in fashion and didn't know anything about it. But when I took my first buying job and, you know, began working in the office, sitting at a desk, doing the tasks every day, I was like, wow, this is like not the environment that I ever expected being involved with clothing would ever be. Like it just was really shocking to me. And I think if I, you know, had that career plan all along and had done some internships or studied it in school, it may not have felt as surprising to me. But I think we have this vision, movies don't help, of what it is to work in
Yeah.
fashion, right? And it's just not that. It's just not that.
Some places are, but those are few and far between, and most corporate environments are not that. But you know what? That's okay. Like, I'm not going to knock all corporate, because there are a lot of great environments and great teams. And I've worked on good teams and had really amazing experiences, and learned so much. So I think, I don't want to completely knock the whole idea of it. There's good and bad, right? As there
Yeah,
is
oh,
with
for
most
sure.
things.
I mean,
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with a friend this weekend where I was like, when I worked in a corporate environment, like for early in my career, like a very established, huge corporate environment, I learned so much, like so much, that I
hmm
still use on a daily basis now when I'm
Yeah.
working with small businesses.
Yeah.
And then when I went to work for startups, they needed that stuff that I'd learned working in the corporate environment to put processes in place and
Yes.
analysis and strategy and all that stuff. And I would often get frustrated by like, oh, there's like no framework or rules here, and everything feels
Yeah.
chaotic, and I'm
Yes.
exhausted. And then
Yes.
after a couple jobs doing that, I was like, okay, I'm going to go back to working in the corporate environment, because I can't stand the wild, wild west of startups. And then I went back to work in a corporate environment, and I was like, I hate this because there's so much structure. And so the point is that there's good and bads of both aspects of it. And even if you went out and started your own line, it's also not a perfect situation, and it's really stressful and scary. And at least in a corporate environment, there's some level of consistency depending on where you're working, and a sense of somewhat stability, right? Predictability.
Financial stability.
Exactly. And what I loved about the early part of my career is like, once I got into the swing of it and knew the routine, it was nice to be like, okay, well, this week of the month, I'm going to do this. And next week, I'm going to do that. And then the next week will be open to buy. And then it'll be sketch review. And just like getting into that calendar was actually very comforting for me. And you don't get that when you work in a smaller environment or for yourself, right? So,
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
the corporate experience is actually important.
Yeah, I totally agree. This isn't my experience, but so my husband is also a technical designer, which is kind of hilarious. And, he also worked for Abercrombie and Express and some big brands, just like you were talking about, having that structure, the processes, the standards, standard tech packs, standard fits, locks, all of these really established guidelines with our factories. And then he went and worked for some smaller companies when we moved to the Twin Cities, that were doing third-party production for, places like Target and Walmart and Carter's. And they didn't have any of those standards. They didn't have any of those processes in place. And it drove him nuts. Because like
Interesting.
nobody knew what they were doing. There was no, standardized fits for anything, or they just didn't have the same processes. So he kind of experienced what you're talking about, where corporate can sometimes, the big companies, yes, it can be a little soul sucking, but sometimes it's a great place to learn like how something should function, so that when you go to a smaller company that doesn't have those things in place, you can know how to put that stuff into place, as opposed to, like you said, it being kind of like the Wild West of like, we don't really know what we're doing. We're just going to like make it up, which can be
Yes.
really frustrating and liberating, but frustrating. It goes both ways. So
It definitely does. Yeah.
I do think it's really important that if someone wants to start their own brand, maybe get a job at a brand first and understand how it functions, understand what you don't like. Like, oh, I do not like how they are running this. I would do it differently. Great. That's awesome that you learned that. And then, start working on your own stuff on the side and save up some money while you were getting like a good corporate salary. Learn the industry from the inside first, because I think it's really hard to start with kind of no understanding of what really goes on in the industry.
Yeah, I think that is really great advice. I'm grateful for all the time that I ended up starting my career in a corporate area, because honestly, like I said, I have used what I learned there everywhere else I went. And all of those places that I worked after that didn't have any of that structure in place. And therefore, I wouldn't have learned that if I had started there instead.
Yes, exactly.
And so
exactly.
even though I could say plenty of bad things about the company I worked for, I can also say like, wow, I learned so much more
Yeah.
than I think I like learned in college, to be honest, that I
Yes.
use in my
Yep.
day-to-day life. So
Yep.
I do appreciate that. Now, my question for you is like, what, and if you don't have an answer to this, it's fine. What advice would you give to people who are like, I want to escape this industry and I don't know how? Because I basically, every time I talk to someone now who has successfully done that, which I would say you have successfully done, I want to hear what their advice would be, because I get this question so often and I don't have an easy answer. And maybe you don't either, but perhaps you have a different answer than me.
There isn't an easy answer. I totally agree with you. I think for this, I think somewhat it comes down to finding out what you're really interested in and what you're
Mm-hmm.
passionate about. Like, what part of the industry are you really passionate about? I do want to say that going to grad school is not the best answer for everybody.
I
Uh,
agree. I can agree with that. Yeah.
I get a lot of people who come, and I've talked to tons of people who are interested in grad school. I have former professors sending me students all the time. And the first thing I always ask them is, what is your end goal? If your end goal is not to go into academia, grad school is probably not the answer for you.
Mm-hmm.
Getting an advanced degree in apparel design, for the most part, means nothing to anybody in the fashion industry. No one, if I were to say, like, go back and try to get a technical design job, they would just be like, oh, so you haven't done tech design for 5+ years? Okay, you're now an associate or you're an assistant again. We're not going to pay you more just because you have an advanced degree. Like, we
True
don't care.
story. Yeah.
But if you're like
Yeah.
trying to become like a really fancy creative designer of some sort of, like, I don't know, high-end brand, maybe it'll help you. And, there's grad programs like FIT that are definitely more design focused as opposed to research focused. So that exists. But I guess to escape the industry, the real question is, what is it that you're really passionate about, that you want
Mm-hmm.
to do and you can utilize your skills? Like, for example, I have a friend, she was a technical designer with me at Abercrombie, and she is now a successful florist and has a really
Oh,
amazing
wow.
florist business. And she does weddings and things. And she's using all of her creative skills and her ability to put colors and textures and sizes together and to create displays. And it's using all of the same skill set. It's just on a different object, really.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, she decided to go off and do something that she was really, really passionate about. And it was super scary for her. And now she's doing great. So I think some of it is like, how do you pivot your skills into something else that is something you're interested in? But that's hard, right? I mean, it's hard to
Yeah.
find jobs. It's hard to showcase your skills in another area. So I think it's a lot of soul searching, asking yourself what you really love, what you're really passionate about. Really, if grad school is what you're thinking about, really spending the time to realize, what do you get with a graduate degree? Where is that going to get you?
Mm-hmm.
Is that, really going to get you to where you want to go? Do you love research? If you don't love to read and write, probably not for you.
Very good. Very important call out. Yeah, I think it's like, what is it that you really want to do? And like we need, and I'm sure there are people who do this, but like we need guidance counselors for adults.
Yes.
Like
Oh, I would have loved that.
people who are going to sit down and say like, hey, like, here's what kind of job do you want? What are your expectations? What do you like? Let's try to figure it out, because I do think like here's the reason, personally, in my opinion, the number one reason people feel trapped in fashion is the financial aspect of it all, right?
Yes.
Because you can keep
Yep.
working and have a paycheck. You're probably
Yep.
underpaid depending on where you work, but at least it's
Yeah.
consistent. But if you leave the fashion industry, whatever you do next, there is going to be a time when things are more uncertain financially. And that's the scary
Yeah.
part, right? For me, that's why
Yeah.
I wouldn't leave, even though I wanted to, because I was like, how will I take care of my kid? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so I felt
Exactly.
kind of stuck, right? People would say to me all the time, like, you should go start your own business. And I was like, doing what? It has to be a really good idea because I'm going to have to pay for college in a few years. And people were like, oh, I don't know, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. And I'm like, I don't think you get it. But, it is going to be hard, right? And like, perhaps going to school is not the solution because that's going to just make it harder down the road. So, but it could be also the solution. Yeah. And I think like, we need adult guidance counselors who just sit down and are like, okay, like what's your deal? What's your financial situation? Let's figure it out, right?
I would love that. I agree. It is so scary. It was so scary for me to leave the industry to go to grad school. Like financially, what you're talking about, I'm very fortunate. I have a partner who had a job and could support me going to graduate school, but that is not the reality for most people or for everybody.
Right. Yeah.
And it's to basically cut our income in half for me to hopefully come out on the other end doing what I want to do is terrifying. But sometimes you have to take that leap and just hope that it works. And I'm in my first year so far. So good. We'll see how it keeps going. I thought I loved the industry too when I started. I did. I loved it for years. And then I kind of was like, nah, this isn't for me anymore.
Let's take a moment to thank some of the incredible small businesses who keep Clotheshorse going via their generous Patreon support. Selena Sanders, a social impact brand that specializes in upcycle clothing using only reclaimed vintage or thrifted materials from tea towels, linens, blankets, and quilts. Sustainably crafted in Los Angeles, each piece is designed to last in one's closet for generations to come. Maximum style, minimal carbon footprint. Shift Clothing out of beautiful Astoria, Oregon, with a focus on natural fibers, simple hardworking designs, and putting fat people first. Discover more at shiftwheeler.com. Late to the party, creating one-of-a-kind statement clothing from vintage, salvaged, and thrifted textiles. They hope to tap into the dreamy memories we all hold. Floral curtains, a childhood dress, the wallpaper in your best friend's rec room, all while creating modern, sustainable garments that you'll love wearing and have for years to come. Late to the Party is passionate about celebrating and preserving textiles, the memories they hold, and the stories they have yet to tell. Check them out on Instagram at Late to the Party People. Vino Vintage, based just outside of LA. We love the hunt of shopping secondhand because you never know what you might find. Catch us at flea markets around Southern California by following us on Instagram at vino.vintage so you don't miss our next event. Dylan Page is an online clothing and lifestyle brand based out of St. Louis, Missouri. Our products are chosen with intention for the conscious community. Everything we carry is animal-friendly, ethically made, sustainably sourced, and cruelty-free. Dylan Page is for those who never stop questioning where something comes from. We know that personal experience dictates what's sustainable for you, and we are here to help guide and support you to make choices that fit your needs. Check us out at dylanpage.com and find us on Instagram at dylanpagelife&style. Salt Hats, purveyors of truly sustainable hats, hand-blocked, sewn, and embellished in Detroit, Michigan. Find us on Instagram at Salt Hats. Gentle Vibes Vintage. We are purveyors of polyester and psychedelic relics. We encourage experimentation and play not only in your wardrobe, but in your home too. We have thousands of killer vintage pieces ready for their next adventure. See them all on Instagram at Gentle Vibes Vintage. Thumbprint is Detroit's only fair trade marketplace, located in the historic Eastern Market. Our small business specializes in products handmade by empowered women in South Africa, making a living wage, creating things they love like hand-painted candles and ceramics. We also carry a curated assortment of sustainable and natural locally made goods. Thumbprint is a great gift destination for both the special people in your life and for yourself. Browse our online store at thumbprintdetroit.com and find us on Instagram at thumbprintdetroit. High Energy Vintage is a fun and funky vintage shop located in Somerville, Massachusetts, just a few minutes away from downtown Boston. They offer a highly curated selection of bright and colorful clothing and accessories from the 1940s to the 1990s for people of all genders. Husband and wife duo Wiley and Jessamy handpick each piece for quality and style, with a focus on pieces that transcend trends and will find a home in your closet for many years to come. In addition to clothing, the shop also features a large selection of vintage vinyl and old school video games. Find them on Instagram at High Energy Vintage, online at highenergyvintage.com, and at markets in and around Boston. Vagabond Vintage DTLV is a vintage clothing, accessories, and decor reselling business based in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada. Not only do we sell in Las Vegas, but we're also located throughout resale markets in San Francisco, as well as at a curated boutique called Lux and Ivy, located in Indianapolis, Indiana. Jessica, the founder and owner of Vagabond Vintage DTLV, recently opened the first IRL location located in the Arts District of downtown Las Vegas on August 5th. The shop has a strong emphasis on 60s and 70s garments, single-stitch tees, and dreamy loungewear. Follow them on Instagram at Vagabond Vintage DTLV and keep an eye out for their website coming fall of 2022. And I would say really you, as a technical designer, have one of the most difficult jobs.
Thank you. I appreciate that acknowledgement.
Especially in the fast fashion era, I think, because your work is so important. It takes time to get it right. And they're like, oh, but psych, you don't get very much time. So could you tell us a little bit about, for those of, for the people who don't work within the industry, what does a technical designer do?
So a technical designer is what I like to call an apparel engineer without the respect or the pay of an engineer.
And lots of stress.
But basically, you have creative designers, or what most people think of as just a designer, and they are the ones who draw pretty pictures and come up with concepts of what they want to create for whatever your product is. And then it gets passed to the technical designer. And in most cases, if it's a company that has technical designers, our responsibility is to translate that idea into reality. So we are responsible, especially in apparel, for the pattern making aspect, usually either creating the patterns ourselves or directing a factory as to how to modify an existing pattern. We're responsible for the measurements of the garment. So how does it measure based off the pattern? The construction, we direct the factory as to how to physically construct the garment, the stitches, the seams, the trims, quality. Making sure the garment is produced in a quality manner. We're responsible for fitting. So getting in the samples, measuring them, fitting them on bodies or forms, working with the designers, the merchants, the buyers, production to make sure that the fit is appropriate. We're also responsible sometimes for packaging, for quality control, for labels, for care, for content, for developing all the sketches for it, for the bill of materials, basically making it happen. I also think tech is sort of like a mediator. We are the ones who have to get up in front of design, merchandising, production, sourcing, and we have to get everybody to agree as to what we're going to do with this product. Everybody's got a different viewpoint. Designers have a viewpoint of what they're trying to do aesthetically. Merchants are obviously very cost focused. Sourcing has, some sort of issues with factories that they want these to go into. And it's our job to listen to everybody's perspective, to put it all together and then say, okay, here's how we're going to meet all of your needs while producing the best quality garment. In theory, that's not how it works everywhere, but that's how it should work.
So here's my question for you. Like, when you started school, were you like, this is what I want to do? Like, did you know that technical design was the path you wanted to take?
Yes, I was pretty certain. I was fortunate. My undergrad was at Iowa State University, and they did have sort of two tracks, technical and creative design. And it was explained early on to me what the differences were between them. And technical is what fit my brain the best, my skill set. It was less about coming up with conceptual ideas of designs and more about how do I execute the design. And that's the part that I have always been more interested in, is how do I make a really good garment? How do I sew it? How do I pick out the right fabrics and the right seams and all of that stuff. And I loved pattern making. I hated draping. That was not for me. I wanted to like draw my patterns by hand, as opposed to manipulating fabric. So it definitely fit my brain the best. But sometimes it's hard for students to know which is better for them, which again is why like going on an internship is like a really great way to learn. Like
Yeah.
what is your brain? How does it work? What makes sense to your brain?
I think a lot of people don't know that technical designer is a job. Like
Yeah.
we don't really talk about it on Project Runway.
No. In fact, most of the
Right?
people on Project Runway probably work with technical designers and don't know how to pattern or sew their own garments most of the
Oof. I
time.
mean, that's probably very, very true. And it's
Yeah.
something that I've encountered through my career working with teams of designers, because I've definitely worked places that were like, we'll just have one designer who can do it all.
Ew.
And that person is a true unicorn,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I've also worked places where we were like, we won't address fit at all. We'll just take whatever the factory gives us,
Yeah.
which is, I know, but like, trust me, I've seen it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, well, let's talk about, like the world of education and how, I don't know, I think right now, I mean, I know you'll agree, we're at a really, I was going to say dark time, but that sounds really depressing. How about I would say we're at a really pivotal time
Yes.
in fashion, in terms of, this is like something I've been thinking about and talking about a lot lately, where I feel like every brand out there is at a crossroads where they can decide that either A, they're going to try to compete with Shein and they're going to make prices even lower and they're going to churn out even more new stuff. And I'm going to tell you, like, any brand who chooses that direction is going to fail because they just can't. They can't do what Shein is doing. Or they're going to say, you know what, we're going to get it together. We're going to start doing better. We're going to go back to where we used to be. We're going to work on using better fabrics and better quality, and we're going to spend more time on fit and getting it right. And we're going to stand for that, right? Like, we're going to say, hey, if you come and buy something from us, it's going to fit you and you're going to love it and you're going to wear it for a long time. And it might cost more than Shein, but it'll be worth it because you won't have to buy 10 things to find something that you like. You just have to buy one. And I think in the dream world that I'm weaving right here, that I still think could happen, it's going to really change what it is to be on those design teams. And particularly, I think it's going to change technical design, right?
Yeah.
How do you think schools could be doing a better job of educating designers for that world that we want?
For that sort of world really comes down to, which we already sort of do, is explaining the current issues with the industry. So making sure they understand what the current problems are, which can be kind of depressing for students to be like, hey, this thing you want to go into is terrible. It's killing the whole planet. It's the cause of all of our global warming. Great. But to express it in a way that's like, but we can change this, but you can do better.
Right.
So it comes down to really educating them on like textiles. Why do we pick certain textiles? Like the performance of them. Like, okay, let's talk about why polyester is okay, but also why it's terrible. Understanding the nuances of what the fabrics are that we're using, understanding why quality construction matters, even if they can't do it themselves. And that's fine. Like, I don't expect a student to come out of school being an amazing an amazing sewist. Like, that's not important, but understanding what makes a good quality construction, I think, is highly important. Understanding the sustainability aspect of what is sustainable production, what are better production methods. I teach specifically a fit and grading class. So in there, I talk a lot about why current fit is terrible and what we can do to make it better, or ways that they could hopefully make it better, or understand why the sizing system is what it is so that they could push for hopefully better change at whatever company they work at. I think a lot of it is it's opening their eyes to the problems, letting them see that they exist, telling them I don't have the answers, because if I did, I would be out there doing it. But giving them that, like, the more you know and the more you're educated on the problems, the more you can advocate for change at wherever you are. And having that confidence to advocate for change, to say, you know what, like, no, this doesn't fit well. Let's get another sample. That's important. Or this is a better construction and this is why it'll make the garment last longer. Yeah, it's more expensive, but it's better. Having that kind of knowledge and being able to push back, I think, is really important.
I think so too.
Because I feel like I didn't know those things, like I didn't know I could push back. I didn't know I could make my voice heard. And it is hard in a corporate setting to do that. But, the more students you educate about that, the more, those voices can be heard and make changes to say, like, whoa, let's take a step back and talk about this, and see if this is what's best. But it's going to take a while. It's going to take, if people at the top don't change their opinions, it's going to be a really tough uphill battle to get there.
Absolutely. So I have a question for you, because, something you said really struck me. Do your students, do they talk about, I think, surely they're aware of the conversations that are happening about fashion right now, right? The industry as a whole. I mean, they're on TikTok, so they know, right? Do they express those concerns already? I'm not saying I wouldn't go to school for fashion in 2024, knowing what I know about the industry, because I would say, like, this is an art form. We need to bring it back to being art. Everyone on this planet needs to wear clothing, so we need to make it better, right? Like,
right. Yep.
Pursuing that path is actually saying, like, I'm committed to fighting for change and improving this and innovating. Do students talk about, like, concerns, misgivings, fears, frustrations related to that, like, the reality of where we are right now with clothing?
Yeah, they do. They really do. And I see it in their work when, for example, I give them projects, when they're developing some sort of line, and a lot of them, really lean into that, like, whole sustainable production method of, wanting sustainable fibers, of wanting sustainable dye processes. So that is something that they're already, coming to the table with, of things that they're interested in. I also see it through, what they are designing, and how there's a lot of intentionality behind wanting to design things for multiple types of bodies, for different types of genders, for not being stuck in some sort of, like, gender box of what they're designing. Of trying to represent who they are as a generation, which I think is very different than our generations were, in terms of how we approach a lot of these things. So I do see that, and they're craving that. They're wanting that information about sustainability, about designing for different bodies, about size inclusivity. That is stuff that, they're asking for, they're interested in. So I see it, and I, try to encourage it as much as I can and get it into the curriculum as much as I can, or just give them the freedom to explore it, to be like, oh, you want to do a skirt for a male body? Great. Please do it. Go explore that idea. Whatever it is that you're interested in this space, like, how can I support you exploring that idea?
That makes me so excited for the future, because certainly anyone who began their career in fashion in the aughts or even the early 2010s, sustainability was not a conversation at all, period. And size inclusivity, like, forget it.
Yeah.
I after I worked for ModCloth and saw, like, what a business impact it made to extend sizing, I was able to get employers that I had after that on board, but it was really hard, even as recently as, like, 2020, to get brands to get on board with adding sizes was just, like, so hard. And I think if we have more and more professionals in that space in the coming years who think about the impact of clothing and the sustainability of it all, or lack of sustainability of it all, and the importance of gender and size inclusivity and the reality of how you can make it happen, I think we could see this really positive change in the industry. Because those of us who started our careers in the aughts or the 2010s, we're not against it,
No.
right? Like, it's just like, the education wasn't there. And honestly, like the freedom to do that kind of stuff wasn't there. I think that as we see the generations sort of leading this industry change, I think we can see that everything go in a better way. I mean, even at my last job, the CEOs of the company were like in their 60s or early 70s, and they just could not understand why we would ever carry clothes larger than a large or an extra large.
Yeah.
Like they just, it was just like, no matter how many times I brought it up or showed the sales and proved that it was like driving sales and actually outselling the smaller sizes, they just were unwilling to do it. And it was sort of like the door was closed. Like they didn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
No data was going to prove it otherwise to them. And it was very, very frustrating because I feel like all of my peers in my age group and younger are like, yeah, why wouldn't we do this? This is stupid. We gotta dress everyone. But it is so hard to change the minds of the people at the top who are kind of stuck in these old ways.
I agree. That's how it was when I worked at Abercrombie. I don't think we sold larger than an XL at the time. I was in menswear, and I think that was our largest size. And keep in mind, this XL at the time, this would have been like 2011, 2012, was like just a more muscular guy, not an extra large guy.
Of course.
Like my size set was just like, he's taller and like a little bulkier and more muscular, which is not real by any means. So, and that was Mike Jeffrey's vision of what our customer was, which was wrong. That's not accurate. So thankfully he's not there anymore. And the brand, shout out to Abercrombie for really turning things around. I have friends who are still there in technical design, and they're doing amazing work to make that company much more inclusive and a better place. So it's proof, right? Like something that is probably one of the notoriously least inclusive companies has turned itself completely around. And I couldn't be happier for them. Like, good job. I'm so excited for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like just like proves something that I came to suspect within my career is that I always worked with super smart, passionate, kind, great people who really wanted to put the best work out there and with the best intentions. But it was the people at the top who ultimately were the decision makers.
Yep.
And you didn't feel as if your voice really mattered.
Correct.
But if you bring someone in at the top who is like into these things, shares your values, or at least wants to hear about them, you can change an entire brand because lots of amazing people work within the industry. Like and that's something I want to remind people of all the time. Like most of my friends have worked in the industry or currently do, and they're all awesome people who share my same values on all of these issues. It's just like we have felt so powerless, but like now my generation is starting to move its way closer to the top in these companies, and that hopefully that means that things are going to change.
Yeah, I hope so. I agree with you. I mean, as much as I didn't like some of the things that I was doing or some of the work that I did, I worked with some of the most amazing designers and teammates and who really did care. And you're right. It's the end of the day. It was leadership who'd be like, no, we don't want that. Your whole line's gone. Redo it. And we're like, oh, okay, cool. That sucks. So I'm really a proponent that like, yes, the leadership has to be in the right place, because if they're not willing to listen to the good work that the teams are doing, it's not going to happen. So I hope that old guard is moving out. It seems like it is to some extent. The more we can educate people on these matters, I think is great. And the more we as consumers can talk about what we want to see from our brands, from our clothing, they have to listen, because they're realizing if they don't listen, they're not going to make it. And it's happening, it's happening with brands and, really having to pay because of social media, which is a curse and a blessing in some cases. But in this case,
I agree. I was literally thinking that earlier today. I was like, sometimes I hate this so much, but it's good too.
Yeah. There's so many great accounts that will hold brands accountable for when they make mistakes and call them out on it. You've done it. Diet Prada does it really well. There's several other ones that are like, no, this is wrong. Like, you need to do better. And it's exactly what people need to do to get these companies and these CEOs to listen about like, there's better ways to go about this, and there's better ways that we can design for real people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think like, we're not being ageist here, by the way, to anyone, like to be very clear,
Yes,
but
yes.
I would work, the CEOs that I would work with over the years, they were often very wealthy, came from generational wealth. So it wasn't even like they were out there with the masses shopping at the same places or even shopping from the brand that I worked for, right? They just had no awareness of the world in which the stuff we were making and selling would exist. And there was often so much confusion about social media specifically, and like how it played into, I don't know, like the social fabric at this point, right? Because this is where we have discussions and call out brands and share information. And yes, like you said, there are many things about it that make me feel unpleasant feelings pretty regularly, or feel frustrated, angry, that kind of stuff. But then I also see that like good things come out of it too. It's a mixed blessing for sure. And I would say that like it was shocking to a lot of these brands. I'm thinking even just like in 2020. That were starting to be called out on social media in like big ways. Whether it was like the pay up movement or their just complete lack of attention to Black Lives Matter, the way they treated the pandemic as a whole, the lack of sizing. Suddenly, these were big conversations, and like they didn't know how to respond. And a lot of companies just tried to ignore it because they thought social media is not real. Like, what could it really do? And they're learning the hard way that, it is real and it changes people's behavior, and it can end a business.
Yeah, for sure. I will also say on the social media side, or product reviews, this is more so to that. If you think that your product review doesn't matter, it does.
Oh, it matters so much.
So much. If the company is paying attention, it matters. I can't tell you the number of times we would have what we would call like big fires that would happen because somebody complained about something on our product online, or they knew, someone had like high up in the company and would write in and say, this isn't working. Like this happened a lot when I was doing more functional design with like handbags and home accessories, but it would suddenly blow up that like, oh my gosh, there's a problem. Someone says this thing is too small, or it's not working the way it's supposed to. And then technical design would just get like bombarded by it. We'd have to pull so many products from the warehouse and check all of it and try to be like, is this a problem? Or is this just one person who like doesn't understand how to use this product correctly? And that's the issue. And I will say more often than not, it was usually user error on things. Which is really frustrating, but when
I've experienced both sides of it for sure. I've seen both.
But sometimes there is a legitimate problem, and we do take those things seriously. Like the companies I worked for did take that kind of stuff very seriously. The quality issues that would be called out in product reviews and things like that. So it's important. Now, don't go like putting in crappy product reviews just because you're in a bad mood, because then you're ruining a tech designer's life on the back end.
And a buyer. Trust her,
so, like, maybe, if something's not working right, like take a moment and think about it first before you complain. But we do take them seriously. They do affect what we do as technical designers, as buyers, as designers. They're really important to our jobs.
Oh, absolutely. I will tell you, the first place I worked that really took reviews seriously was ModCloth. And we weren't even allowed to reorder anything if it had below a certain average review score. Wow. And beyond that, like we had someone on the team who would look at reviews every week and send like a newsletter of updates about it so we could learn from it and look for recurring issues. Yeah. Now my next job was at Nasty Gal, and they didn't have reviews. And I was like, guys, this is bad. Like, you need to have reviews, because honestly, when you work in the e-com space, this is how you learn what your customer wants. Right. So they integrated reviews, and perhaps where this was not a good idea for them is their stuff was crappy. And so all the reviews were bad. We think they got rid of them. But I remember specifically one way that the buyers and the designers found out about a massive product quality issue was via customers emailing in, and I think even some called. And it was specifically this bathing suit that they rushed through. They needed to have it basically in time to ship out for people to have for spring break in Coachella. And I remember for my friend who was like overseeing that space, like it was stressful. It was down to the wire, and the warehouse had to rush it through to receive it. And they just barely got them out to customers on time. And then there was like a 2-week period where everybody who bought that bathing suit was on spring break or at Coachella. And during that time, the company received many emails and many furious phone calls about this bathing suit, which ended up being made of the wrong fabric, but it had never been QA'd in the warehouse. And so women would get in the pool in this bathing suit, and it would expand with the water and fall off of them. This would be mortifying. I would like have to go home if this happened to me. But I was like, this company should know better. Where did this break down? But I felt horrible for all of these women who no doubt were like very traumatized by being suddenly naked at a pool party. But like the buyers and production and the design team would have never known about this if people hadn't spoken up. And I think because like so often we are very disconnected from what actually ships out to the customer. Like because QA is not as robust as it once was, meaning like inspecting the order to make sure it fits well and is in the right fabric and whatnot, you would be surprised how little we know.
Yeah. As you move faster, not getting an actual pre-production sample that is to what you are going to be cutting, which sometimes happens where we do like, I don't know if you did this, I'm sure like a correct and proceed sort of situation where.
Yep. Do you want to explain that to everybody what that means?
Yeah. So in sort of the sampling process, usually we go through several rounds of sampling, like a first sample, second, and then typically the last one we get is what's called a PP sample or a pre-production sample. And it should be accurate to all of the trims, the fabric, the color, the fit, construction of what will go into production. But as things always change in the fashion industry, sometimes we make changes at that stage, or sometimes there's still a mistake, right? The factory made a mistake. In theory, you should get a second pre-production sample to confirm that everything is correct. But time is of the essence. Money speaks. So often we will do what's called a correct and proceed. So we'll tell the factory, you can proceed to production, but you need to correct X, Y, and Z. And then you often will not see a sample of that actual correction. So you're kind of doing it on good faith. Or maybe you get a photo from the factory, which again is sort of still a good faith situation, right? And
yeah,
if you're lucky, you might get what's called TOP samples, which are top of production. So I don't know if you dealt with these, Amanda, but like getting first sort of set of samples from the first run of production so that we can check it to make sure there's no major issues. So sometimes you'll see it at the TOP stage and make sure that it's correct. But again, oftentimes by the time you get TOPs, it is too late to change anything because of how fast.
It's on the boat,
right? It's on the boat
or in the plane.
Yeah, and they do it on purpose that way because, the factories know how to play this game.
Yes.
So, when you do something like that, like a correct and proceed, like that's how you can end up with massive fabric mistakes because you'd be like, yeah, make sure you use the right fabric. Yeah.
I mean, this became more and more often like how it was functioning all the time, that we would maybe get that first sample. And if it was really egregious, we would do a second sample. But then after that, it was like, forget it. Like we have to proceed and to production and hope for the best. Rarely would we get that first sample and be like, let's move forward. But sometimes, I'm sure that's what happened with the swimsuit. There was no time because someone wanted it for an email or whatnot. And this was speeding up so much that often, because that pre-production sample should have been exactly, by the way, we would call it a pre-pro, because that pre-pro should have been exactly what was going to go into production, we could use that for photo shoots or send out for PR. And over time, like that couldn't, it was not even an option, right? Yeah. And so then we would be asking for additional samples to be pulled to ship to us or photography or sending out for PR. So we're like airing more stuff over here. Sometimes we would get that TOP, which once again should have been pulled from that production run. It shouldn't be made separately. It'd just be part of that. We would get that TOP sample, and then the real shipment would arrive. and they would be totally different
Yeah.
also.
Because they would be made in the sample room sometimes. They would get around it by making the TOPs in the sample room instead of off the production line.
Talking about the sample room, this is like off topic, but I think you will have thoughts on this as well. So I was talking about this with Dustin, my husband, last week, and we were talking about sampling and how sampling costs money, and it actually costs more money than the actual production of that item for the bulk production, right? Like, because it's a one-off, it just costs so much more money, and it's not free. It's not free for anyone, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there was an article that came out last week about Trader Joe's. So this is like a totally different category of stuff, but
Okay.
the way it worked so much like fast fashion was not lost on me. Also, the writer blatantly said that, but I was like, oh, wow. As I was reading the article, I was like, this could have been anywhere I worked. Substitute chili crisp oil for an off-the-shoulder dress, and it would be the same.
Oh my God.
So basically what Trader Joe's was doing, or is doing, is they would approach these small brands, because there's like more small food brands than ever. It's like kind of exciting, actually. And they would approach these brands and say like, hey, we are interested in carrying your product in stores. Could you send us some samples? And they'd send them. And then they would say like, hey, we would like to change the recipe a little bit. Could you make us this kind of version or that kind? So the brand, a very small business, would create a new recipe and create a new sample, even with the packaging, all that stuff, and send it to Trader Joe's. And then Trader Joe's would ghost them and make their own version of that sample, which is like the most fast fashion thing ever, right? And
It's terrible.
I have worked places that would like take a sample from a brand or a designer and just copy it. And the people who would send us those samples spent money to have them made. And it was more than just the cost of making a dress, because often it's like we're printing this really small run of this very specific print on the fabric for the sample, right? Or we're buying just enough buttons and trims and stuff to make this garment. The people working in the sample room obviously charge more to sew because it's a one-off thing than an entire production run. There aren't the same efficiencies built into it. And so no matter what kind of company you are, if you are taking these samples from another brand, a smaller brand, and copying them, you are not only stealing their idea, you're actually like taking their money. It's wild. It's
Trader Joe's article, but man, you're right. The comparisons to fast fashion are terrifying with that. Whew.
I know. I had been like not a big fan of Trader Joe's for the past couple of years because they've been doing all this union busting stuff. But I had assumed, as my husband had as well, when we were talking about this, that like when we would go to Trader Joe's and you might see chili crunch oil or some other product that was reminded of a smaller food brand, that either they were like private labeling it with that brand, or that the Trader Joe's team is just like really up on food trends and developing their own, not asking a small brand to do the work of creating it and then stealing it. Like really, I was just like, oh gosh, why is everything just so terrible sometimes? Can't we have nice things?
That's what happens. Like you would get, designers would send samples directly to the factory and just be like, make this. And that's how you bypass having a technical designer, basically, is just take a sample from another company, send it to the factory and just say, make this in this fabric. And I want, 20,000 of them, and not fit it. That's what Forever 21 does. That's what Fashion Nova does. I mean, yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, Shein works from like a photo,
Yeah.
And to be honest, I would send photos of things to factories and be like, can you make something like this? Like this is what you're told to do. Once again, this is like stuff that's coming from leadership. Like no one who loves fashion or has a great sense of values or is a creative person is like, what I think is a good idea is just copying someone else. But the pressure is like, it's not even pressure. It's like, you're going to do this.
Yeah.
Like in the early part of my career, it was very normal for an executive to walk by your desk and put a bunch of magazine tears on your desk and be like, make these things. And then it turned into, with magazines going away, being emailed stuff from blogs, and then blogs going away, and then them just buying stuff and dumping it on your desk.
Yeah. I mean, and
it's very normal.
It's hard. The whole issue of knockoff and copyright is so tricky because to some extent, everybody copies. So then, is it just okay? No, But you could argue with big brands copying other big brands, like at that point, like who the hell cares? But the issue of big brands taking stuff from independent designers, I have a
Yeah.
very big problem with. That's wrong. But Abercrombie maybe getting a sample from Express and knocking that off, like, they used to be the same parent company. Like, who the hell cares?
I mean, that's what the industry is. Like, guys, go ahead and copy each other
Yeah,
all day, every day. But when it's like, oh, we bought this from this maker at a
yeah,
market and now we're going to copy it, I'm just like, you could do a collab with that maker
yeah,
and put some money in their
yeah,
pocket. Like, what? It would cost you
yeah.
nothing at the end of the day, but it would be more work and things might go more slowly. And it's very frustrating. I mean, this drives economic inequality. It makes it worse, right? When we're just like, oh, we'll just
Yeah,
copy them. It's
yeah.
fine. We'll just keep moving, keep moving. And the whole Trader Joe's thing was so disheartening. And I was telling Dustin that, of course I had to go see what people on the Trader Joe's Reddit were
No.
saying about it. And well, it was 50-50. People being like, that's it, I'm not shopping anymore. Like, this is the last straw. And other people being like, who cares? That's what business is. Everything sucks and the world's on fire. Go ahead and shop at Trader Joe's. And I was like, guys, come on. We can't do that. We can't do that. Like, we have to
Yeah,
care,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully people are giving Trader Joe's a hard time on social media and they'll like figure something out. But I was like, very, very, I mean, like I said, I'd had feelings about Trader Joe's for a while, but I was like, oh God, no, why? Why does everyone have to be terrible?
I know.
If you're enjoying this episode, then this is a great time to remind you that my work here at Clotheshorse is made possible by the support of listeners like you, just like NPR, and these great small businesses. Please go give them your support. Blank Cass, or Blanket Coats by Cass, is focused on restoring, renewing, and reviving the history held within vintage and heirloom textiles. By embodying the love, craft, and energy that is original to each vintage textile as I transfer it into a new garment, I hope we can reteach ourselves to care for and mend what we have and make it last. Blank Cass lives on Instagram at blank_Cass, and a website will be launched soon at blankcass.com. Located in Whistler, Canada, Velvet Underground is a velvet jungle full of vintage and secondhand clothing, plants, a vegan cafe, and lots of rad products from other small sustainable businesses. Our mission is to create a brand and community dedicated to promoting self-expression, as well as educating and inspiring a more sustainable and conscious lifestyle, both for the people and the planet. Find us on Instagram at shop_Velvet Underground or online at www.shopvelvetunderground.com. St. Evens is a New York City-based vintage shop that is dedicated to bringing you those special pieces you'll reach for again and again. More than just a store, St. Evens is dedicated to sharing the stories and history behind the garments. 10% of all sales are donated to a different charitable organization each month. New vintage is released every Thursday at wearstevens.com with previews of new pieces and more brought to you on Instagram at wear_st.evens. That's Wear St. Evens. Country Feedback is a mom and pop record shop in Tarboro, North Carolina. They specialize in used rock, country, and soul and offer affordable vintage clothing and housewares. Do you have used records you want to sell? Country Feedback wants to buy them. Find us on Instagram at Country Feedback Vintage and Vinyl, or head down east and visit our brick and mortar. All are welcome at this inclusive and family-friendly record shop in the country. Republica Unicornia Yarns, handmade yarn and notions for the color obsessed, made with love and some swearing in fabulous Atlanta, Georgia by head yarn wench Kathleen. Get ready for rainbows with a side of giving a damn. Republica Unicornia is all about making your own magic using small batch, responsibly sourced, hand-dyed yarns and thoughtfully made notions. Slow fashion all the way down and discover the joy of creating your very own beautiful hand-knit, crocheted, or woven pieces. Find us on Instagram at Republica_Unicornia @republica_unicornia_yarns and at www.republicaunicornia.com. Picnic Wear, a slow fashion brand ethically made by hand from vintage and dead stock materials, most notably vintage towels. Founder Danny has worked in the industry as a fashion designer for over 10 years, but started Picnic Wear in response to her dissatisfaction with the industry's shortcomings. Picnic Wear recently moved to rural North Carolina, where all their sewing and accessories are now designed and cut, but the majority of their sewing is done by skilled garment workers in New York City. Their customers take comfort in knowing that all their sewists are paid well above New York City minimum wage. Picnic Wear offers minimal waste and maximum authenticity. Future vintage over future garbage. Cute Little Ruin is an online shop dedicated to providing quality vintage and secondhand clothing, vinyl, and home items in a wide range of styles and price points. If it's ethical and legal, we try to find a home for it. Vintage style with progressive values. Find us on Instagram at Cute Little Ruin. Is there a little bit of Italy in your soul? Are you an enthusiast of pre-loved decor and accessories? Bring vintage Italian style and history into your space with the Pewter Thimble. We source useful and beautiful things and mend them where needed. We also find gorgeous illustrations and make them print-worthy. Tarot cards, tea towels, and hand-picked treasures available to you from the comfort of your own home. Responsibly sourced from across Rome, lovingly renewed by fairly paid artists and artisans, with something for every budget. Discover more at thepewterthimble.com. Deco Denim is a startup based out of San Francisco, and it sells clothing and accessories that are sustainable, gender fluid, size inclusive, and high quality, made to last for years to come. Deco Denim is trying to change the way you think about buying clothes. Founder Sarah Mattis wants to empower people to ask important questions like, where was this made? Was this garment made ethically? Is this fabric made of plastic? Can this garment be upcycled? And if not, can it be recycled? Sign up at decodenim.com to receive $20 off your first purchase. They promise not to spam you and send out no more than 3 emails a month, with 2 of them surrounding education or a personal note from the founder. Again, that's decodenim.com. Let's talk a little bit about the size and grading, because, I mean, you know, every brand, everything you buy from even the same brand will fit differently.
Yep.
It actually makes like shopping secondhand sometimes more complicated. Like
Yeah.
when people don't put measurements on Poshmark or ThredUp, I'm like, guys, like just because I wore a medium in another thing from this brand doesn't mean I could wear like a 3X in this thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and you and I working within the industry, we like take for granted. But could you just explain a little bit to people who don't have to swim in that sea of frustration why sizing is such a hot mess?
Sizing is such a hot mess because there's no standards. There's no mandatory sizing.
Literally.
That's
Yeah.
the answer.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says what an 8 is. That's the problem. In the United States, I want to caveat this, that everything I'm going to say is U.S. specific. There are size standards in different countries. Mm-hmm. But the U.S., of course, does not.
Yeah, it's just like, do whatever you want, put any label in it. It's fine.
Yeah,
no big deal.
Yeah, you know, it's all about capitalism. So, but women's is the one that's, you know, traditionally more of an issue. So the short spiel of where sizing comes from, and I'm going to skip over a lot of things, but here's the short version of it, is basically there was no sizing standards at all because there has traditionally been everything was made to a person, right? You know, historically, you would go and get custom garments made by your tailor or your dressmaker to fit your body. Mm-hmm. And then as we learn better production methods, things start to speed up and we start to have to standardize things to do mass production because you cannot mass produce one-offs. It's not possible.
Right.
So traditionally, men's is based off of body measurements. So like your chest, your waist, and your inseam. And this comes out of the Civil War, where they measured thousands of military recruits to create sort of standardized uniforms so they could produce them faster. And that was sort of our first standardization of any sort of civilian menswear. Women's has always been more difficult. There were some early attempts to do this in women's in the late 1800s as we start to move into ready-to-wear production. There's been a few different, people doing this throughout time, but sort of the oldest and most widely sort of used one comes not until the 30s. It's called, if you really want to get into it, PS 4270, the Voluntary Product Standard. And this is fun if you want to get really upset about things.
I love that. A hobby for me.
As I was reading about this, I was like, oh, I hate this. It was done in the U.S. government in the 30s to collect, they collected the weight and 58 size measurements of about 15,000 women in the United States. As is tradition in the United States, they only used white women for the study.
Of course.
As most of our data sets are that we use, it's very biased and skewed. So they did apparently measure some women of color, but then they didn't include them in the data set. But that was their attempt to be like, look, we did measure women of color. And women were paid to participate. So there was sort of a disproportionate populations in the study, tended to be more lower income women who often were malnourished. So they didn't represent regular body sizing. It wasn't also geographically representative of the US. So basically it's a very skewed data set. And so this was collected in the late 30s. And then eventually the results, after some sort of trial and error of sizing standards, was published in 1958 by the National Bureau of Standards. And this established what we now have today is like our Missy sizing. I've seen stuff where they say they established sizes 6 through 22. Some other places say they established sizes 8 through 38. It kind of depends on what you're looking at. But basically, that's where we get the naming for Missy sizing, which is traditional women's sizing. Plus size or older women was typically called like women's, and Missy's was like, I don't know, women in their 20s through 40s, I guess. I don't know. And it's based, of course, on the hourglass figure. And it used the bust size to create an arbitrary number sizing system. So the number doesn't equate to actually a real body measurement. They were just like, oh, a 6 equals this bust size, 8 equals this bust size. And then there was also an indication in the sizing for your height. So short, regular, or tall. And then your lower body or like your hip circumference. So plus or minus. And that was sort of the sizing data that we had. It didn't have male bodies. It didn't have children. And this was not a very popular sizing standard because it didn't reflect real people.
Right.
Yeah. And consumers, actually, this is a great example of early consumers not agreeing with a sizing standard. So in the 70s, this sizing standard was declared voluntary, and it was actually withdrawn from the National Bureau of Standards in the 80s.
Oh, wow.
So you can still find it. It is some of the earliest large scale data sets that we have on bodies in the United States. So there is some interest there in terms of, it is basically the only early study we have on bodies. So it's important in that aspect, but it is skewed and biased, obviously. And then in the 90s, we get the American Society for Testing and Materials, which is the ASTM. And if you're not familiar, for those of you who aren't familiar with ASTM, they establish standards for testing all sorts of things related specifically in all sorts of fields, but in apparel, we use a lot of ASTM standards for like, how do we test like the quality of garments? So like tear strength and crocking and seam strength and all sorts of things. And so they made a standard for adult female Missy sizing in the 90s. It's been updated several times. They updated it in 2011. But again, it's non-mandatory sizing. It's just their recommendation of this is what standard body measurements are. They now have women over 55. Ooh.
Wow.
Getting progressive. And originally they started at a size 2, but now they go down to a size 00.
Okay.
And then ASTM has continued to update. They have, ones for maternity, for men, for children's. So these are standard body measurements from big surveys they've done of bodies in the United States. And a lot of companies will use this to establish sizing for their brands. There's also other data sets out there that we can use. There's like Size USA that did body scanning of women, and is one of the larger body scans that we have, 3D body scans of women. Fun fact I like is that the hourglass sort of shape that we said was the standard, it only existed for 8% of the women in their study. So
interesting, because I have worked places where that was the body type we fit around. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not, it's not ideal because it doesn't exist.
Right. Right.
And then there's some other ones. So the reason that sizing is so terrible is partially there's no standards. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different data sets, and a lot of the data sets are skewed or biased. The data sets that do exist from other companies like Size USA or Alvanon are very expensive to purchase that data from them. So if you don't want to invest money in purchasing that data, you don't have data to work off of. So that becomes a problem. So that's part of the reason that there's just no standards. And I think some of it is that companies don't want to be told what they have to do, right? Big business doesn't like to be told what to do. So yeah.
True story.
And, that's just more fun to be confusing, I guess. It's annoying as a technical designer that there's no standards. There's, as we well know, a 0 in one brand is not a 0 in another brand. The number is a number. It's hard to get it into your mind, especially as someone who's female identifying, that number means nothing about who you are. But yet so much of our identity is linked to that number, and it's frustrating, and it's very demoralizing sometimes that, my number on my tag represents my self-worth when that number is complete and utter bullshit. And
it means nothing. It means nothing. And, these things are so much more random than you would ever expect. For example, every place I've worked has fit on a different body type. And that's with the caveat, if they are fitting at all, right? So at ModCloth, Hourglass was what we went for, all sizes. And I would say of all the places I've worked, best technical design team of anywhere ever. The company cared so much about fit, much, right? But like you said, Hourglass, not as common as you would think. Now, when I went to Nasty Gal, the body type that we were fitting on was like smaller chest, wider hips, bigger butt, because that was the CEO's body type. And so that's random, right? And so I was in fit sessions where they were like, we don't really want our tops to fit anyone over a C cup. It's just like not our look. But if you didn't know that and you had a D cup and you want to try a shirt on and it couldn't fit, you would start to feel like something was wrong with you. But actually, no, it's just a bad product strategy. I've worked places where it was more, we're looking for like a more straight or athletic build, a younger, like places I've worked are fitting on people who have maybe not even fully gone through puberty yet, which is also a very different body type. I also worked places where we didn't fit at all. And so we would say like, here's our order. And then maybe they'd send us a medium and we'd get someone in the office to try it on. And my one job, my worst job ever, where I don't know why you would start a clothing company without any real interest in clothing or care for making good clothing. But this job definitely was just like, well, we come from marketing. We think marketing is what I know. So they didn't have a technical designer. They didn't have a designer. And there was a woman who worked in the office that the CEO swore was a medium. And I'm going to tell you that is absolutely not true. This person was a small and a very a very straight athletic build small. And if we got a medium sample in and it fit her, then it was a medium. And it was good. And if it didn't fit her, then we went from there to make it fit her to the best of our ability. And so everything fit differently. And nothing fit true to size in any regard. Because if you're saying that this person who's definitely a size small is a medium, then everything's going to run too small. And the grading was terrible. And we let our factory do whatever. And I finally, after enough begging and pleading, got allowed to spend a little bit of money to get a technical designer to measure what we had and come up with some grading that actually worked. And she was like, wow, it's really interesting. I pulled a sample of every piece and every size of all the suiting we sold and sent it off to her, and she measured it, and she was like, wow, it's really interesting. Like in a lot of these styles, whether it was a blazer or the pants, the medium, the large, and the extra large all had the same measurements. Now imagine you go in there and you're like, oh, I'm a solid large, and you can't even get into the extra large. You leave feeling really bad. But it's nothing to do with, I mean, first off, you shouldn't feel bad anyway, but this is just how random and unimportant the sizing and sewn inside is. But this has a real world impact on people,
Yes.
Yes. So it is just like so arbitrary, and it's based on what this brand has decided is their body type and how much they've been willing to invest in getting the fit right and how much time the designers had and if the factory actually executed it. And you and I, when we were preparing for this, we also talked about how tolerance could change how things might fit. So could you explain that a little bit to everyone?
Yeah, so a tolerance is a range of acceptable measurements for a garment. So anybody who makes anything, you know that when you make multiples of something, they aren't going to be completely identical in terms of how they measure or how they look. So in mass production, and especially in apparel, like it's not, mold injected or, made out of metal with some sort of machine that can make it perfect like you can in let's say car manufacturing. Mm-hmm. So every product has a tolerance of what is acceptable for it to still count within that size. So for example, I worked on bottoms for a long time. So you have a waist measurement that, let's say the waist of your pants is supposed to measure 30 inches. Mm-hmm. But you can accept something that measures, let's say, plus or minus half an inch to be within tolerance of your size. So that means you could accept a waist that measures 30 and a half or a waist that measures 29 and a half inches. So right there you have within the same size, a 1 inch difference in a waist measurement that could be considered acceptable for that size. So tolerances are super important, and it's why it's good to have a good technical designer because they can work with the factory to figure out what is an acceptable tolerance range for your factory, for your fabric, for the style. Wovens always are going to have, for the most part, a tighter tolerance than knits because wovens don't tend to stretch out during sewing, whereas knits will typically grow. The more you use them, the more you handle them, the fabric continues to stretch. But tolerances means that you could pick up, let's say, 3 of the exact same product, and each 3 could fit differently. One could be too big and one could be too small, but it's all labeled the same size because that's what the tolerance is. Mm-hmm. And I know this, and it's still disheartening for me when I try on something that's supposed to be my size at a brand that I've shopped at and it doesn't fit.
Yes.
But then I know, okay, let me go back and pick up another one from the stack and let me try on that one. And maybe that one will fit me. So it's a little bit of a fun guessing game sometimes.
Yeah. And you can see
it can be really frustrating.
If everything on a garment was off a little bit in tolerance, you have ultimately a very different garment. So classic is like you go buy a pair of black skinny jeans from somewhere and you really like them and you wear them all the time, and you go online and you order a second pair in the same size, and then they show up and you're like, what the heck? These fit completely differently. They're longer, they're tighter, they're weird in the thighs. This is why, once again, it's not a reflection of you at all. It is a reflection of how complicated this all is and how it can go awry. And, in the early part of my career, when I was working, for Urban Outfitters, we had a whole team in the warehouse that all they did was QA. So every order of apparel that arrived, they would open it up and they would pull about 10% of the units out of there, and they would measure everything to see if it was in tolerance. And if less than a certain percentage were out of tolerance, then they would accept the whole order and receive it. They might take those few that if they were really egregious and, damage them out or whatever and charge back the vendor. But in general, like it would be believed that if 10% of them were within tolerance measurement wise, then the order was good. Then if they found
Yep.
actually like above a certain percentage were out of tolerance, they would pull the entire order and measure the whole thing. And then we would get
Yeah.
into a situation where we'd be like sending it back to the vendor or trying to get it repaired, domestically. And, the vendor would eat
Yep.
that cost, all kinds of things. And in this process, they would also discover quality issues. And I
Yep.
assumed, once again, going back to like, I started in a big corporation and then I went to work other places and it was totally different. I assumed that everybody did something like that. And I'm here to tell you that is not the case. So everywhere else I worked, the only way something like this would be triggered, this process of QAing, is if we started to get weird customer feedback or it went out to the stores and people were like, something weird is going on with these.
Yep.
Otherwise, it would just pass through. And so once again, like if you do buy something and it fits really weird, if something is egregious about it, you should speak up because oftentimes no one knows at all
Yeah.
why. I mean, I bought
Yeah.
a pair of pants once from Zara that I couldn't get my foot through the foothole. I mean, that is like how the kind of stuff that happens, right? And there was a
Yeah,
moment
it
where I
does,
was like,
yeah.
God, I guess my feet are just so big. And then I was like, wait a minute, no, pants,
No.
feet should go through pants,
Yes.
And I think
Exactly.
like, unfortunately now with everything being so much faster and budgets being cut more and more, there are not people QAing this stuff in warehouses at all.
Yeah.
And so it's just a mess.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I've seen that with some of the companies I've worked for where QA, and layoffs and things like that. They lay off QA managers and the people in the warehouse, which can have massive ramifications down the line because if nobody's checking that product, we don't know that there's a factory issue. And, issues at the factory can be factory driven, but they can also be an issue with how it was originally designed. Potentially it was designed too fast, but sometimes it is purely like the factory messed up. And that happens a lot. And we don't know about it if we don't get, TOPs or if we don't have somebody at the warehouse checking things. And so, when you're not doing that, mistakes happen. And you get bad things. Another thing that corresponds to this is fitting across the size set, getting samples in that represent your entire size range of your product and fitting it on bodies in your size range to actually see, like, is the grade that we established appropriate for this product? Does it look good on other size bodies? That's expensive, right? To get in 10 of every single one of your products, to get models in, to try them on, to take the time to do it. So as things move faster, at companies I worked at, we would start to get less and less size sets. We would maybe only get a size set for things that had an order number over a certain amount, or like a key fit, like this is our classic sweatpant, like we're going to fit a size set of it. But if you're not looking at a size set, then maybe your medium looks great, but it doesn't look good when you get up to the other sizes because there's something wrong with your pattern grading. There's something wrong with production in the larger sizes, or it just doesn't work on that body type. So, a lot of these fast fashion companies, if they're fitting at all, they're fitting one size. And that's it. And they're not looking at the other sizes.
And I want to be clear that that's been my experience, that we would often fit on someone who is like a small or a size 4. And maybe if we did extended sizing, we might fit like the 1X or something. But that was...
like a jump size set.
And like I honestly feel that like what happens is the sizes in between often end up being like really weird. That's where like the fit really falls apart. So, speaking of like things speeding up and brands having less time and fitting less sizes, what else have you seen, the whole fit process? How have you seen that shift through your career?
One thing I would say is just the greater emphasis on costing. So,
yes.
How do we make our product cheaper? Which can impact the fits. Can we shorten this slightly so that we can reduce the amount of fabric that we're using? Things like that. Just having to be faster, less fittings. Like you mentioned, sampling is expensive, so less fittings. Now, one thing I will say that is a positive that I want to talk about, of something that's coming out in terms of technology that is hopefully going to, if utilized correctly, maybe solve a lot of these issues we've talked about, is the use of 3D pattern design
Mm-hmm.
systems. I don't know, Amanda, if you're familiar with any of
I
these.
mean, I have friends who have been using them lately and they rave about them.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So there's a bunch of systems. There's like Browseware, there's Clo, and these are pattern systems that integrate 2D computer drafting, which is what we normally use, with the ability to drape your garment on an avatar in 3D. And so you can actually do a lot of pre-fitting and fit corrections and design changes in a 3D environment before you actually sample anything. So you're saving, all that sampling cost
Mm-hmm.
and all of that time, but it also, you can fit on any size avatar that you want. So you could make your size set in the 3D system, grade your pattern out and look at it across a full size set in 3D and see how it looks. And so that is a really cool thing that we're teaching our students and that the industry is heavily utilizing to, I think one, it is in relation to fast fashion, right? So we can digitally mock it up first before we see it, but it does save money and it does save some time,
Mm-hmm.
but it has the advantage of being able to solve some of these problems of not being able to see things on bodies, of being able to see something in 3D and hopefully solve fit issues before they go out to the actual customer, or being able to be more cognizant of what does a style look like on a different type of body than we have access to.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't have access to the models that are the correct size or a physical mannequin that's the correct size, but I can do that in 3D and I can look at it on the correct body shape and size in 3D and see if it looks good. So the ability to use 3D in conjunction with fitting, I think I really, really, really hope is going to revolutionize things and make things better and get technical designers and designers to say like, hey, wait, like we can do this in 3D. Let's look at it on a different size body and make sure this works. Let's look at the size set and make sure this fits
Mm-hmm.
correctly because there's no excuses. You can do it in 3D. You don't have to spend the money to get the sample. So let's do it.
I think this is amazing. And I think about like, if you have the luxury of doing 2 or 3 or 4 fittings, these samples are being made, shipping
Yeah.
back and forth. Like there's so much
Yeah.
waste involved
Yeah.
in that, and often these samples are not
No.
wearable afterwards because they're being
Yep.
all cut up in
Yep.
the fitting, and so like that alone could be like an
For
environmental
sure.
win. But also, like, I mean, I don't know about you, and it's different places I've worked. This has been more of a problem. It was definitely a major problem at Nasty Gal, where our designers were really encouraged to design from the runway, but then we obviously had to
Yeah.
deliver a very different
Yeah.
price point. The idea would be amazing in sketch review. We would all be losing our minds over it. It was so good. We can't wait. The first sample comes, right? We're in the fitting and we're just like, wow, this is not a thing that should even
No.
exist or could
Yeah.
exist, right? And we're in the first fitting, cutting it apart and trying to like
Yeah.
glue it back together basically and make it work. And it could have saved that.
Yes.
Like that wouldn't have had to happen
Yes.
if you could model
Exactly.
it out on 3D first. It'd
Yep.
be like, this actually doesn't work this way. This isn't how clothes work.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So we would have a lot of that for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. I think it has the ability to do that and for design to really explore their ideas before we waste a lot of samples, right? Or for tech to explore
Yeah.
fit corrections without having to get, sometimes we'd have a fit concern at Abercrombie and then I would request like 4 or 5 mock-ups because I wasn't sure what was the correct way to solve the problem. I was like, I could do this, I could do that. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what's going to get me there. So I'm going to get like 4 versions of it. Again, that's a lot of waste, but that fit was really important to us. So it was worth it. But now I could just do it in 3D and know this is the correct solution. Now my next sample is going to be awesome and it's going to tick all the boxes for design and we're all going to be happy. So that's something I'm like, space to watch the 3D evolution within the fashion, industry. And what is it going to do? Is it going to just make fast fashion worse? Potentially,
Mm-hmm.
but is it going to solve a lot of the issues that we have with fit and with quality? Maybe. Or give
Mm-hmm.
tools for technical designers or people entering the industry to be like, hey, let's use this thing to make it better, is what I'm hoping that it will do, is give people more tools and more ways to speak up, to say, like, we have ways to solve these problems that don't involve a lot of extra cost, which is always the reason things get cut, is costing. So let's use
Yes.
them to our advantage to make a better product. That's my hope. I really, really, really hope that's what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And it's interesting to think about how cost can really impact the fit process,
Yes.
because it's often like, okay, well, we can't afford to line this.
Yeah.
So, like, that changes the fit, or a zipper's too
Yeah.
expensive. Can we just add some elastic
Yeah.
at the back? I mean,
Yeah.
you've heard these
Yes.
all.
I've
It's
done it.
now it's a 3/4 sleeve,
Yes. Yep.
or et cetera, et cetera. And so, and that really does change the fit
It does.
process, and actually does slow down that process or prevent you from getting to the right fit, because perhaps you've already fit the first sample and then the pricing still
Yep.
isn't working. And then it's like, okay, well, let's just put in an elastic waist and do
Yeah.
this, and then
Yeah.
like, just go to production,
Yeah.
So it just
Exactly.
exacerbates the problem. I think knowing these challenges up front will be really, really
Yeah.
helpful.
And that kind of stuff also, really, it changes what design wants, by having to do costing. I mean, the amount of things I've just really had to cut back because of cost parameters is so disheartening sometimes. Not as
Yeah.
much when I was doing sweatpants and hoodies at Abercrombie, because there's not that much to them, right? It's
Right.
not, there were for some of them, but when I was doing accessories and home goods, it definitely was a situation where, subbing in less expensive zippers, like a smaller gauge zipper, in places, which, ultimately, in my opinion, compromised quality sometimes. Subbing, less expensive fabrics or less expensive interior structures that go into, like, keeping a handbag upright and things like that. And then, having complaints about, why is my zipper breaking? And I'm like, because I was told to put in the cheaper zipper. And I told you this was
Yep.
a bad idea, and that after wear testing, there were complaints, and yet you still proceeded with it. So stuff like that is really costing, can really make the job of a tech designer very disheartening, because ultimately we are there to protect quality, and to put out a high quality garment, and costing just is like constantly stabbing you in the heart over and over again, because you're not allowed to do the thing that you're supposed to be doing.
I mean, it's the same thing in the buying side, where you're just like, oh man, now we have to buy this. And like, it as your
Yeah.
assistant is writing the
Yeah.
order, that this is going to go on sale. Like,
Yeah.
that's the only way it's going to sell.
Yeah.
But it had to be that way so that you can make the costing. And so ultimately, like, by having to hit this costing, it's actually like not even going to be profitable in the first place, because it's going to have to go on sale. It's just like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a whole thing. I'm sure the people who made those Zara pants that I couldn't get my foot in, they were like feeling the same
Yeah.
sense of despair, and
Yeah.
just like, why do we do these ridiculous things?
Yeah. Something I want people to understand is that the people who are working in the industry, who are the ones making these decisions, like Amanda and I did, worked really hard to make the best decisions that we could possible with the parameters that we were given. And so, sometimes it's out of our control as to what we can do. The best thing that you can do sometimes is just say, I don't agree with this, and I'm going to record that I didn't agree with this. So when it comes back, I can tell you, like, that was a bad decision. But, like, honestly, most people are trying to do their best to produce something that is quality and that fits. And it's the overarching system that they're working in that is what is letting them down. But those employees,
Yeah.
they do care. So it frustrates me when I see people getting mad at designers or tech designers and saying, why didn't you do better? And it's like, we're trying really hard. We're doing our best. Like, please, like, we're doing our best.
Yeah.
Like, it's not our fault. Like, it's the system that is telling us what we should be doing that is causing the problem. We do really care about making good stuff. We're just not always allowed to make good stuff.
No one has ever been like, oh, I can't wait to go to work today and make something that will be trash soon and disappoint people.
No,
Yeah.
that's not why we do this job. That's not why we went into the industry, but that's why we end up leaving, is because that's what we end up having to do to meet, the company's requirements. And that's disheartening. But also, like, if you have friends in the industry, like, please check in on them and support them and
Yeah.
tell them they're doing a good job, because they're trying real hard. I guarantee you.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the emotion that we have involved in the work that we create within the industry, which often right now we have to kind of like turn off. Because if you
Mm-hmm.
get emotionally involved in everything you create, you will not do well
Yeah.
emotionally pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How could we take that like emotion, that creativity, that desire to make good things? How could that lead to more sustainable and meaningful design, especially in the clothing realm, that could change what customers are being offered and ultimately make this industry more sustainable? Like how could not having to compartmentalize our emotions when we're creating this stuff, how could that make something better?
I think this really deals with sustainable and like smaller production, because I think at the corporate level, it is really hard to integrate emotion back into the process. But I know, Amanda, what you're getting at is sort of this reference back to some of my dissertation research, which focused on designers who upcycled quilts into fashion garments, which I know you've done a whole episode on. And I was listening to the other day, and like, I just wanted to jump into the conversation while I was listening to it. I was like, oh my God, I love this so much. But some of the stuff that came out of a lot of my research was this whole concept of that the materials, the quilts that these designers worked with, were creating these really strong emotional reactions in the designers. And that was what was fueling their design process. Like, they really connected to sort of the history of the objects, to whatever, was the aesthetic properties of it, to thinking about who made this and why did they make this quilt, and what was that person going through in their life
Right.
when they made this quilt? Like, was this their, emotional escape from whatever was going on at their life in the 1800s or in the 1930s or the Great Depression, something like that? Like, what was their reason for creating this beautiful object? And now what is my reason for creating something new out of it? And how does that sort of lead to the design process? I had this one designer who I interviewed who had this great quote that she said, "We can sense the story even when we don't know what the story actually is." That, these materials just have so much story in them, and tapping into that is what they do to create these new objects, these, garments that's made out of these quilts. And so I was really struck by this emotional response these designers were having, because it was so different from everything I had ever been taught,
Right.
or anything I had ever experienced. Like you said, we learn really quickly in the industry to not be emotionally attached to our products, because inevitably they're going to get cut or changed. And the more you emotionally connect to your products, the harder it is for you to disconnect from that sort of, when you get criticized on something, when something gets cut, it can feel very personal.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's just about the product. It's not about you. But as someone who's a perfectionist, that's something I always really struggled with, right? Is not taking offense to something being changed. Like, it's my fault. It reflects who I am. And it's like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't reflect who you are. It's just about the design, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, honestly, like, and I'm sure this is even bigger conversation you have to have with the more junior members of your staff in design. But like in buying, one of the first lessons I feel like I'm teaching, like the new assistant buyers, is like, hey, you cannot get your feelings wrapped up in this product, because you will never make it through this job. Like, it is the hardest lesson to learn, especially if you put so much time into it. It might get changed. It might not sell. It might go on markdown. The executives might hate it. You might get yelled at for buying it. The stores might send you messages saying, this is the ugliest thing I've ever seen, which would happen. Or like when I was at Nasty Gal, Jezebel liked to do posts about all the ridiculous stuff that we'd bought and had on our website. And you'd have to be like, it's okay, whatever. You loved it. It's there. It's great. It's fine. There's no such thing as bad PR, right? But you have to throw your emotions to the side. And I feel like, I mean, there's not a lot of glamour when someone's like, hey, we have all of this liability fabric, meaning fabric that was left over from a canceled order that you have to use. right? And you're
Yeah.
just like, I hate this fabric. I can't imagine what we'll do with it. And now I got to
Yeah.
make something
Yeah,
out of it. Like you
exactly.
can't, like,
Yeah.
what's inspiring about that?
Exactly. So that's what this like my research with these, and these are small designers who are doing very small batch orders. Like what everything is one off from, whatever materials that they source. In this case, specifically quilts is what they were sourcing. And it really made me rethink what I knew about design and how to kind of approach design in that like is this, putting all of your emotion into it of responding to your materials emotionally and letting that material guide your design process as opposed to a customer,
Right.
right? Typical design is customer driven. What's the problem I'm trying to solve?
Right.
Who is my customer?
Right.
And instead, this was much more about that relationship that designer formed with their material. And what does that material tell me it needs to be? What is appropriate for my material. And this is not just with quilts. I think you could also see it with anybody who is upcycling sort of these older textiles,
Yeah.
like linens and laces and toweling and things like that, is putting this sort of much more emotional spin on it. And the hope, and this is where I don't have the data to back any of this up, but this is where I'm hoping eventually we'd be able to see is that by doing this, consumers feel that emotional connection to the object because they understand there's a story behind it. There's an intentionality behind it. And therefore they will hold on to that object longer, to that garment longer and value it. Because it isn't just a disposable thing. It isn't just made without emotion by, a designer who sent a picture to the factory in China.
Right.
That it was made with a lot of intentionality and purpose for the history and the meaning of those materials. And the hope is that the consumer feels that and will value it and not throw it away and see it as, an object to hold on to and to continue to use and to cherish. That's what I think a lot of these designers are hoping. I don't have anything to prove that. That's just sort of the conclusion sort of stuff that I got out of my dissertation, that this is where I think this sustainability space could go is it's great to use sustainable materials and all of that stuff. But if the consumer doesn't buy in to that sort of emotional connection, I don't know if they're going to continue to hold on to the object. It's the same thing. It's sentimentalism. Like, why do we hold on to the dress that no longer fits us?
Yeah.
Because it reminds us of some special event or time in our life, and we're not ready to let go of that thing. So if your clothing is coming from a more intentional place, a more emotional place, perhaps we'll hold on to it longer. We'll value it. We'll want to use it more often and, encourage this sort of different approach to design that's more built around like building community and building emotion and value with, our objects and with our designers. It's a real pie in the sky concept, but I see it and it's happening. And I think it's a really cool place that we could move. I don't know how you do it on a corporate level. I don't know if it's possible. I don't have an answer. But I think it's a great space for people who do want to go and be independent designers, is like really think about being intentional and emotional with your design and tapping into who you are and what your materials are. Because I think that's one really interesting way that we can break this cycle that we're stuck in, is to bring that emotion back into this whole process, as opposed to being so customer or greed and profit driven with everything.
I mean, I love that. I do think, this is one of the reasons that I really appreciate and support and lift up small brands and designers, because that's what they're doing. And it's hard for me to see how that could happen at, say, like Zara, but that doesn't mean it couldn't. And I think we don't lead with materials at all anymore in the industry. We lead with cost.
Yeah.
We lead with, I'll tell you this as the buyer. I'm saying I need 7 dresses. 2 of them have to be midi. 1 of them has to be long sleeve. 3 have to be black. They have to be, one has to have a puff sleeve. Go make it. And then the fabric is sort of like, well, here's what we could afford.
Yeah, exactly. Which leads to everything we've talked about: quality issues, fitting issues, sizing issues, when we're not paying attention to the base materials.
Yeah.
And that's what fashion used to be about, the fabrics that we used to make, you would go to the store or the dressmaker, and you would pick out the fabric.
Yep.
And then you would create the design around it. So materials are the base of everything that we do, but we've lost connection with them. We've lost connection with them as consumers. We've lost connection with them as designers. And I think the materials are so important in driving the design process, the quality, the fit, all of it.
Yeah.
That's where we need to get back to.
I agree. So I just wanted to ask you one more question. And this is, I feel like today I'm hitting you with all the questions I get most often. So thank you for answering them.
I love it.
The last one is, why don't more brands make clothes for people of different sizes and beyond? I'm not just talking like, extra small versus 3X or anything like that. I'm talking about tall, petites. I've gotten, and I don't know if it's the same person. I think it's just it's a question that people have. Why aren't there clothes for people who wear plus sizes but are petite? Why aren't there more clothes for people who are really tall? And I mean, I know the answers, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple reasons for it. One is obviously every brand has a target customer, right? They're like, our customer is Emily. She's 25 and I don't know, does stuff. I don't know.
She's 5'5".
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, it gets that specific.
It does,
yeah.
right? There is like a specific consumer profile of who your customer is, which I do want to say, I do think is important. Like as a larger brand, you should have a customer in mind of who you're selling to, because if you're selling to everybody, you're selling to nobody. So
it's a true story.
Right?
Yeah.
And I do respect people who say, well, this brand should carry every single size possible. But if that's not within the brand's wheelhouse or the brand's identity of who they are, that might not be the best thing for them. Like, do you really want a brand who can barely make stuff that fits for their normal category to also be producing stuff for other sizes? Like, they might not have the right aesthetic for different sizes. And I think we need to be okay with that to some extent, that certain brands are going to cater to very specific people, and that should be okay, because that might be what is best for that brand and their aesthetics, right? But in terms of like, making clothes for in general, I mean, it's obviously comes down to costing. It's, it's expensive. Lack of data. There's, the data is behind that pretty expensive paywall for a lot of this. So that can be problematic for especially smaller companies. How do you afford $20,000 to buy size set data from a company of these other sizes? That's really hard. Not having tech designers who know how to fit other size bodies. And I'll be honest, we don't teach enough in school about fitting to other sizes. Part of that is we just don't have the dress forms in the classrooms. The pattern making books are based off of, a very white female body standard. That's part of it. Although using 3D in the classroom has been a game changer, because now I can teach about fitting other size bodies to an extent. There's not enough time ever, though, to teach all the things, unfortunately. So, there's a lack of knowledge, right, of understanding the needs of different types of bodies and different consumers. And designers don't know how to design for them, because honestly, designing for a plus size body, a petite body, a tall body is different. You can't just apply the same design aesthetics across the board. It doesn't always scale. It doesn't always work. And so knowing how to design appropriately and proportionally to those size bodies is really important. But we aren't taught how to do that. So unless you find yourself in a space where you can learn how to do it, you don't know how to do it. But I think honestly, it's cost, right? It's expensive to produce so many versions of one product. From an allocation standpoint, how do you allocate, 10 or 15 different sizes of one product? Like, how do you figure out how many of those are needed in each store? Like, that's really hard. It's really cost prohibitive. The more sizes you make, the more fabric you need. The larger the sizes, the more fabric it takes, which unfortunately is why plus size sometimes costs more, because it takes more fabric. I think that's a terrible reason, but that's the reality of what goes on in the industry. There's a lot of reasons, but I think it's cost, and it's probably somewhat of lack of just really having understandings of how to appropriately design and fit for different sizes and different
Yeah.
shapes and things like that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, yes, I do think a lot of the mass retailers should be offering more sizes in general, because if anyone can do it, it is them.
Right.
But I think, maybe there are stores that are just for petite people or just for tall people.
Yeah.
And, the thing is, we don't need just a handful of like billion-dollar fashion companies. What we need are a lot of different smaller brands
Yeah.
that cater to different people.
Yep.
And like maybe, before I had been like, I never want to be involved with making clothing ever again. Before I had that moment a few years ago, I had been talking for years how I wanted to start a clothing line that made like, basically took like the Urban Outfitters aesthetic of like cool, trendy, younger person clothes and offered them in plus sizes.
Yeah.
Because I was like, Urban Outfitters will never do that. Yeah. And people want these clothes. And when I would talk to people, I talked to a few people who were interested in being involved or doing production or whatnot, and really believed that we could get money. And I just like, never mind, I don't want to make clothes. But everybody who talked about, who would ask me, they were like, okay, but are you going to make all sizes then? And I was like, no, we'll only make plus sizes. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Because people who are a size medium can go to Urban Outfitters. Right. Like this is going to be like as a group of people who never get to buy cute clothes, like because the industry ignores them. And we don't need to dress everyone. That's okay. Because if we pick what we want, who we want to dress, and we work really hard at it, they'll get great clothes and be really happy. And I think that's the thing, is like the problem is that most brands are just dressing the same group of people. Yes. And I don't even know how they remain competitive at this point. And really like diversifying is the way forward.
That they're not. I mean, a lot of these brands are struggling I read hardcore.
I read their annual reports all the time. I mean, it's bad. And if maybe they had decided to really niche into one customer base, things might be different. But everybody's like, no, we'll just do extra small through large. Right. Every brand will just do extra small through large. Yeah. Well, that'll work. It's just like, no, it's like bad business. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So that is like my vision for the industry of the future, which is just more small brands. Yeah. Who serve one customer like really, really well. Exactly. Instead of like a bunch of humongous brands that don't serve any customer very well. That's kind of where we are.
Right. And that's what I was trying to say is like, if your brand, this, mass brand that's only served extra small through extra large the whole time suddenly releases plus sizing. Yeah. I would be skeptical to be like, are you doing it right? Did you hire specialists in plus sizing? And are you creating designs that are appropriate for plus size and fitting them appropriately and grading them appropriately? That's why I'm like, I don't think it's worthwhile necessarily to complain to every large company, you need to offer more sizes. I would say instead, as a customer, go and find the small brand that is specializing in what you need, because hopefully they are doing it right and they're going to do it better than that large brand that is stretching themselves too thin across multiple product categories. I think that's, oftentimes when a business gets started, they start to branch out into different things. And the more things you do, I sometimes think the less better you're doing them. True. So, if you're going to be an independent designer, focus on doing one thing really, really well and making it awesome and serving that customer really well. Don't do everything, because you won't, you'll struggle. Like, go find that like hole in the market. For example, my husband is, he's 5 foot tall. He's short. We have to buy children's clothes for him. Nobody makes short men's clothing. So somebody out there, go start making cool short men's clothing, because we will buy it, because their short men exist. And they deserve to not buy children's clothes.
Yeah. Or like my husband is very tall and has very long arms, and we cannot find a shirt that is long sleeve that covers his entire arm. Please, somebody. Yeah. No, I agree. Right? I mean, that's the problem of like, everybody's making the same clothes for the same customer. And there are all these other people out there who are just making do. And I think the future is more specificity.
Right. Which is what we used to have, like essentially made to measure would be great to get back to that model, but it's expensive, right? Clothing becomes very expensive when you go to that model. But maybe we can get to a model of smaller designers who really specialize in one particular fit or customer type. And then it won't be so cost prohibitive to be able to buy that clothing. I don't know, but there's lots of great ideas of how we could get there. It just takes designers who want to do it, and it takes investors who are willing to invest in those ideas.
And people to show up and support those brands. Yes,
that too. Very much so. Customers,
specifically. Yes, thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Well, thank you so much, Colleen. This was so much fun. Do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom that you'd like to share? Or it's okay if you don't have any at all, because you just shared so much wisdom over the past 2 hours.
Oh, final thoughts or word of wisdom. I would say for anybody who's interested in going into the fashion industry, just know it's tough out there. So being flexible and, being able to move quickly with things is really important. But also, don't be afraid to speak up and point out things that you don't think are correct, that aren't being done well, of being vocal about how can we do this better. Because if employees continue to just stay silent, nothing is going to change. So, the more that we as people in the industry speak up, the more as we as consumers speak up, that's how we're going to make change. So, just continue to be a voice of reason, of like, there's a better way. We should make this fit. We should take more time. Let's be more sustainable. And also, support your friends who are already out in the industry and who are struggling to make it and to survive in this environment. And, if you know friends, tell them they're doing a good job. If you meet people, tell them they're doing a good job, because it's really hard.
Yes.
It's tough out there. So, be a good consumer, but also, support the people who are at the bottom working really hard to make you what you have. Same thing, support the people at the factories. Those people are so talented and get paid nothing, which is depressing. So, but I think it takes all, like you've been saying all this time, Amanda, it takes all of us, right?
Yeah.
To speak up.
We have to
make changes. And we can, I think you're right. We're at a point where we can make changes to this industry, whether that's through educating students, educating ourselves, being better consumers. We can do it. We just got to keep working on it, keep trying. We can do it.
We can do it. Yeah, I think that we are at, I really believe we're at a point where we can. Honestly, it's like social media gives us access to giving immediate feedback to brands and whatnot in a way that we never could before. And so I do think we need to take this moment and make it happen, all of us.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you so much, Colleen. This was a true delight. Thank you so much to Colleen for sharing her expertise and experience with us. I hope you all have a better understanding of how fast fashion has changed fit, even though it was kind of broken to begin with. Fast fashion has really changed just everything about everything that is sold to us. Can we agree? We're talking about Trader Joe's here too. It's wild. It's groceries, it's pillows, it's shoes, it's furniture, and of course, it's clothing. I do hope that what you've learned from Colleen has inspired you to think about a better future for clothing, at least, because I know she inspired me in a lot of different ways. I've been thinking about our conversation nonstop for the past few weeks. Okay, well, that's all for this week. I will share that Trader Joe's article in the show notes, along with some information about Trader Joe's anti-union tactics. I have to say, I'm no longer a Trader Joe's customer after learning all of this about them, which is too bad because they had a few things. They still have them. I don't know why I'm talking to them like they died. I guess they died in my mind. They have some things that I have really loved over the years, including a few of their dips. Anyway, I'm not here to sell you Trader Joe's. I'm here to sell you against Trader Joe's, I guess. But that is a good moment for me to remind you of the show notes. So every week, I create a whole set of links that are sources for the things I share in the episode, along with other things I think you might enjoy reading or thinking about. It's where you can find information about how to contact me or anything else that's going on, like the Clothes Horse Jamboree. In fact, there was this 1 month period where I was getting a lot of emails to my personal email address, which was very strange because I really, to be honest, if you email my personal email address, your email is probably going to get lost because I get so much spam coming in there every day as part of my job as a consultant for people who, run small businesses. I subscribe to just about every brand or retail newsletter. So like if you email me at my personal email address, it's going to get lost in there because sometimes I can't even scroll through all of it. Anyway, I finally asked someone, why did you email my personal address and where did you find it? And that person said, I couldn't figure out what your email address was. And I was like, oh, wow, it's in the show notes of every episode. So everybody, do not snooze on the show notes. There's stuff there for you. Like I said, lots of links, information, whether it's my email address or how to get tickets for the Clothes Horse Jamboree or anything else that's going on. They're in the episode. You can also find them at clothehorsepodcast.com. So please use the show notes. I take great pride in them. Okay, that's all for now. So here's where I say again, thank you for listening to another episode of Clothes Horse, written, researched, edited, hosted, show notes created by me, Amanda Lee McCarty. If you like what you're hearing, rating, review, tell your friends, subscribe, all the stuff that every podcast host tells you. You know why they all tell you that? Because it helps. It helps get Clothes Horse into other ears. And that's really, really important because you and I, we take for granted all the stuff we talk about here, but it's a whole new world to people who've never heard it before. And learning this stuff really will change what they do in the future and what they think about and the conversations they have with other people. So MBD, no pressure, subscribe, rate, review, all that stuff. Just the future on your shoulders. No big deal. If you'd like to support my work financially, there's Patreon. There is the Apple Premium subscription and there is Ko-fi. All those links, they are in the show notes and they are at clothehorsepodcast.com. Lastly, but never leastly, a special thank you, as always, to Dustin Travis White for our music and audio support. I promise you he had a lovely birthday. We went for a long bike ride. We had sushi for dinner. We went to a weird bar near our house that we'll probably never go to again. Too much gun propaganda in there for my taste. And yeah, we planted some strawberries. It was great. Okay. Talk to you all next week. Bye.